Hey guys, before we get started, I want to thank you for your support on the first video. It was our channel's first video and it got decent exposure. We're still working on things to make the videos better. I only expect the quality to go up from here. And I would appreciate it if you guys gave us a like and hit the subscribe button. Currently 65% of you haven't subscribed, and for those of you that have, it means a lot. Now, let's move on to the video. Today we have Ray on Nicol Bolas the Ravager. This is a deck that is a mix of creatures and planeswalkers, leaning more into the Super Friends theme. It seeks to gain advantage by controlling the board state with creature removal, making the planeswalkers difficult and sometimes impossible to remove, while also proliferating and stealing your cards. Overall, very powerful and hard to stop when it gains advantage. Next up, we have Dylan on Toralf. This deck seeks to put Toralf on board and to punish creature-heavy decks by putting damage doublers and triplers and playing mass damage board wipes, using Toralf's non-combat damage to deal big damage to all creatures on board, and then trampling over that damage to the opponents. This deck also runs Underworld and Lion's Eye combos to close out games with ease. Next up, we have Sam on Jodah. This deck is actually really interesting. It's a Wooburg commander that seeks to put out Jodah and run high CMC creatures that come out and gain advantage. With cards like Apex Devastator and Omniscience, it's really easy for this deck to completely destroy its opponents in the mid game and plays a fair amount of stack pieces that make it almost impossible to deal with. Overall, one of the most unique decks in our pod since it can be played many different ways. And lastly, we have me on Slicer. This is a Voltron commander that seeks to play Slicer quickly and take over the board and deal fast commander damage to win games. It plays low CMC equipments and enchantments that make Slicer very large, very quick, and runs stacks pieces that make it difficult or annoying to remove Slicer. And with that out of the way, let's move on to the game. Welcome to Game Day's Commander. Let's get started. Dylan wins the high roll and goes first. Dylan plays a mountain and casts a gamble. Gamble resolves and Dylan searches for a card. Dylan will discard a card randomly, and he discards the Soul Ring he gambled for and passes to me. I draw for turn and play a mountain for turn. I cast a Mana Vault. Mana Vault resolves and I tap it. I play a Lotus Petal, sacrificing it for a red mana, and cast Slicer for as more than meets the eye cost. With the floating colorless mana, I play a Voyager Staff and move to combat. I swing Slicer at Dylan. He takes 3 commander damage from Slicer. At the end of combat, Slicer will convert. I pass the turn to Sam. At the upkeep, Sam will gain control of Slicer. Sam draws for turn. He plays a Shattered Sanctum tap and moves to combat. Sam attacks Ray for 6 commander damage from Slicer. After that, he passes the turn to Ray. At the upkeep, Ray will gain control of Slicer. He draws for turn. Ray plays a Bloodstained Mire and cracks it, taking a life. He searches for his Steam Vents, having it come in tapped. Ray moves to combat and swings Slicer at Dylan. Dylan has no blocks and takes 6 commander damage. Ray passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, and at the upkeep, Dylan will gain control of Slicer. Dylan draws for turn and plays a mountain. He taps 2 mana and casts Varchild's War Riders. Dylan moves to combat and swings Slicer at Sam. Sam has no blocks and takes 6 damage from Slicer. Dylan passes the turn. I untap, and at the upkeep I take 1 damage from Mana Vault. I draw for turn. I play an Opal Palace for turn and then move to combat. I swing Slicer at Dylan. Dylan declares no blocks and takes 6 commander damage. I pass the turn to Sam. Sam untaps, and at the upkeep he gains control of Slicer. Sam draws for turn. He plays an island for turn, taps 2 mana and casts an Izzet Signet. Sam moves to combat and swings Slicer at Ray. Ray has no blocks and takes 6 commander damage from Slicer. Sam passes the turn. Ray untaps, and at the upkeep he gains control of Slicer. Ray draws for turn and plays a Badlands. Ray moves to combat and swings Slicer at Sam. Sam has no blocks and takes 6 commander damage. Ray passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, and at the upkeep he gains control of Slicer. Varchild has an upkeep trigger, putting an age counter on it, and everyone creates a 1/1 survivor token. Dylan draws for turn. Dylan taps 2 mana and casts a Felwar Stone. Dylan plays an Evolving Wilds. Dylan cracks it and fetches a basic mountain tapped. Dylan moves to combat and swings Slicer at Sam. Sam blocks with his survivor token. Dylan passes the turn to me. At the upkeep I take 1 damage from Mana Vault. I draw for turn. I tap 2 mana and dash in a Ragavan. I move to combat and swing Ragavan at Sam and a Slicer at Ray. Sam has no blocks and takes 2 damage. Exiling the top of his library, hitting a land. I create a treasure. Ray responds to Slicer by tapping 2 mana and casting a Cyclonic Rift targeting Slicer. It resolves and Slicer goes back to my hand. I pass the turn to Sam. Sam draws for turn. Sam taps 3 mana and casts a Rhystic Study. Rhystic Study resolves and Sam passes the turn to Ray. Ray draws for turn and plays a mountain. Ray moves to combat. He swings his survivor token at Sam. Sam has no blocks and takes 1 from the survivor token. Ray passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, and at the upkeep he has a Varchild upkeep, putting an age counter on it, and everyone creates 2 1/1 survivor tokens. Dylan draws for turn. Dylan plays a mountain for turn. Dylan taps 4 mana and casts his commander, Toralf. Rhystic Study will trigger and Dylan will pay the 1 mana. Dylan passes the turn to me. I untap, and at the upkeep I take 1 damage from Mana Vault. I draw for turn. I tap 1 mana and cast Ragavan. Rhystic Study will trigger and I will not pay for it. I tap 2 mana and cast Goblin Engineer. Rhystic Study will trigger and I will not pay for it. I put a Soul Ring into the grave and I pass the turn to Sam. Sam untaps and draws for turn. Sam plays a mountain for turn. Sam taps 2 mana and casts a Golgari Signet. Sam passes the turn to Ray. Ray untaps and draws for turn. Ray plays a mountain for turn. Ray taps 2 mana and casts a Nightscape Familiar. Rhystic Study will trigger and Ray will pay for it. Ray passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, and at the upkeep, he will put an age counter on Varchild, giving everyone 3 1/1 survivor tokens. Dylan draws for turn. Dylan casts Chain Reaction. Rhystic Study will trigger and Dylan will pay for it. Ray casts an Arcane Denial. Dylan responds with a Deflecting Swat, targeting Arcane Denial. Rhystic Study will trigger for both casts, they will not pay. Chain Reaction will resolve, dealing lethal damage to the entire table, with the help of Toralf dealing excess non-combat damage to the entire table. And with that, Dylan wins the game. GG.